Thank you. So I will call on our second speaker, Diego from the Scottish Human Rights Commission.
Difficult to follow that very good presentation, and thank you very much. May I start by thanking the organizers for the invitation, and it's a real privilege to be here in Ireland, and also with such a multidisciplinary panel. My background is law, and I always apologize for being a lawyer because we are very narrow-minded. So it is great to be with, and I'm talking only for myself. So it's great to be in a panel like this. So I'm the policy officer of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which is the national human rights institution for Scotland. The Commission has been established by the Scottish Parliament in 2006 and became operational in 2008. So we are quite a recent institution. We have a number of powers and that we exercise for the promotion and protection of human rights in Scotland. And we work quite closely together with the Equality and Human Rights Commission in England and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and of course with the Irish Human Rights Commission, as we are the chair of the European National Human Rights Institutions. I should begin by explaining that this is it's not an academic paper, but is a practitioner reflection of the work, process, and thinking that the Commission has undertaken in the area of climate change and human rights since 2008. And I'm going to try to go out of here.
Okay.
So my paper is titled Climate Justice in Scotland. How do we get here and where are we going? And there are three themes that I would like to share with you today. All of them are bound by one common theme, which is the need to rethink the current approach to climate change. The first area that I would like to discuss is that climate change can interfere significantly with the effective enjoyment of human rights. The second is that human rights considerations add a vital dimension to climate change policy and solutions, and this is going to be discussed in much more detail tomorrow through the human rights-based approach. And the third is how climate justice has become part of Scotland's climate change policy. Let me take each of them in turn. So the first proposition that I'm making is that the challenges and urgency of climate change is frequently communicated in terms of fiscal policy, depleting resources, and economics. And the solutions are framed in ways that fit always an overarching goal of economic growth. The Stern Review in the UK provides a prominent example of this. Of course, this type of analysis is of value, and there is an important aspect on economic analysis, but it is also incomplete. It restricts conceptualization of climate change and their potential solutions and policy responses. While there are some reference to the human impacts of climate change today, these are made in an aggregate, in a general manner. So I'm not saying that human rights are not discussed, but there is a lack of rights-based approach and perspective to the human issues within climate change. And this can be seen in the IPCC report, which scantily mentions human rights. There are around 150,000 deaths attributed to climate change globally each year. And we should remember that those most at risk of climate change are those whose human rights are most widely denied. So it is now paramount that the social dimension of climate change, such as health, empowerment, right to housing, participation, as well as non-discrimination and any inequality, are brought to light and properly discussed and considered. So, first point, the overall point is the current approach ignores key considerations. There is a clear correlation between environmental degradation and human harms. Generally speaking, human rights are impacted by climate change in two ways. One is the direct physical impact of climate change, and two, the indirect impacts of climate change through policy responses such as adaptation and mitigation. Now, in relation to the first, for example, extreme changes in temperature and rainfall can create conditions in which disease spread and pose threat to the state's obligations to provide the highest standard of health. Similarly, extreme weather conditions could lead to crop failure and reduction in livestock, as well as depletion of agricultural soils. This would have an effect on the right to adequate food. Floods could lead to negative impacts on access to housing, clean water, and sanitation, all factors which directly induce migration and displacement. And we heard very clearly about this from Cosmin some minutes ago. So as you can see, I could enumerate a long list of human rights that can be directly affected by climate change. Furthermore, the European Court of Human Rights has also read procedural rights within the right to private, family life, and home, which is Article 8 of the Convention. And this procedural right includes participation, access to justice, access to remedy, and transparency. Now, sometimes the very measures put in place to help people to adapt and to mitigate the worst of climate change impact can exacerbate discrimination and inequality. This is particularly true for people living in poverty, indigenous people, IDPs, internally displaced people, and the destitute elderly. For instance, the cultivation of biofuels can lead to forested land being turned over to agriculture, to water being diverted, and to communities to be forcibly displaced. So there is an impact on land rights, right to water, right to food, right to health, and cultural rights. Despite good intentions, adaptation strategies that promote the shift to low carbon energy is likely to impose minimum energy performance standards and have the potential to increase the cost for users, some of whom cannot afford the increase. And this is a real issue for many people living in Scotland. There is a clear correlation between fall poverty and mental health and human health in general. So fuel poverty should be a priority for a range of coinciding concerns, including poverty alleviation, health and well-being, energy efficiency, and carbon saving. There is also clear evidence that the effects of biofuel in policies in Europe and the US have raised questions about the impacts of this on food security and prices in vulnerable importing countries. So we have to make sure that the measures to combat climate change do not undermine existing rights or exacerbate inequality. Likewise, mitigation measures under CDM or REDD+ could result in violation of human rights. Therefore, it is crucial to integrate a human rights-based approach to adaptation and mitigation measures to ensure that all peoples and communities are protected. So my first point is to show the distinct impact that climate change has on human rights, direct and indirect impact, and the urgent need to provide a greater emphasis to the human dimension of climate, the climate debate. The second theme of my presentation is about the added value of a human rights-based approach. So what is a human rights-based approach, and why I'm arguing that it will help the current approach? A human rights-based approach is a conceptual framework developed by the UN some decades ago for the process of human development and based on international standards. By international standards, I mean universal, international agreed standards. There are three key elements of a human rights-based approach: empowering people to know and claim their rights, and increasing both accountability and the ability of those responsible for respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights. So it is a methodology that embeds human rights in the design, implementation, and evaluation of law, policies, and programs. And a concrete example of this is impact assessment. So that's an example, which could be human rights impact assessment, or it could be integrated impact assessment, environmental, human rights together, and equality impact assessments. So human rights are useful when analyzing complex problems, and it could help in the design of regulatory and inspection frameworks, thus enhancing the ability of decision makers. A human rights-based approach also provides a strong moral framework based on the universality of human rights. A key feature of a human rights-based approach is that promotes the prioritization of the most vulnerable in society in order to avoid discrimination and exacerbation of inequality. Remember that the impact of climate change can exacerbate this inequality. So a human rights-based approach would contribute to achieving equitable realization of climate change policy. So this approach offers then a number of legal, moral, and practical benefits to the current climate change analysis. The third theme that I would like to discuss is climate justice, and climate justice in Scotland in particular, to share our experience with all of you, which I had the fortune to meet Mary Robinson, or Miss Mary Robinson, a couple of times, and personally, and with my boss, and she's always jealous, saying that she started with the idea of climate justice, but it's Scotland who has put that into practice, and she always makes that comparison. So let me start by clarifying that the concept of climate justice adopted in Scotland is quite different, it's quite unique, and is wider and is bigger than previous concepts developed by the environmental justice movement in the 1980s, but follows very closely that definition and the work of the Mary Robinson Foundation. Climate justice is, according to the motion adopted by the Scottish Parliament in 2012, a concept that brings together issues of climate change, human rights, and development, asserting that the consequences and causes of increased CO2 emissions reflect and reinforce inequalities globally and within nations. I deliberately took all the entire motion of the Parliament and for you to see, which is quite long and is quite complex, but the reason is that it reflects the variety of stakeholders involved drafting the motion and also the multi-party approach. So climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change fairly and equitably. This can help states that lack the economic resources to adapt to severe climate change. By the way, the Scottish Parliament became the first legislature in the world to adopt unanimously across all the political parties a motion committing Scotland to championing climate justice. And the importance of the motion is the political consensus which is shown by the legislator in Scotland. And this has framed the debate of climate change in a very particular direction. And the question is, how did we get there? Well, for me, 2009 set the foundations with the passing of the Climate Change Scotland Act, which, as you might know, is a very ambitious instrument to reduce emissions by at least 80% by 2050. Very interestingly, the legislation had a strong support from business and civic society. Later that year, the Scottish Government agreed a joint communique with us and civic society to pursue the development of a human rights-based approach in addressing climate change at the local, national, and international level. So for me, these two elements were key in providing the framework, the legal and policy framework, to enable climate justice to grow in Scotland. So after that, I will give a couple examples. In 2011 was also an important year, as the First Minister of Scotland called world leaders during a visit to China, which is quite interesting because, as you know, leaders and politicians avoid talking about human rights in China. To make 2012 the year of climate justice ahead of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio the same year. He emphasized that, and this is a quote of which you can see the rest on the slide, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to link economic development and human rights in global energy policy. As mentioned, in 2012, climate justice was consolidated by the consensus shown by the Scottish Parliament. In May 2012, the Scottish Government launched Scotland's Climate Justice Fund, committing £3 million to supporting water projects in sub-Saharan countries for the next 3 years. And last year, they renewed this commitment to support climate vulnerable communities in Malawi, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia. In December of 2012, at Doha, Scotland committed to host an international conference on climate justice, aimed to support international efforts to deliver a global climate agreement by championing climate justice as a key driver of global development. And finally, last year, climate justice became formally a Scottish Government policy, with the second report on proposals and policies for a low-carbon Scotland 2013-2027, where climate justice features quite prominently. As you can see, there is a clear international dimension to climate justice. Having this in mind, the Commission focused on the national dimension, which is now reflecting in Scotland's National Action Plan for Human Rights, which was launched last December. The National Action Plan, which is the first of its kind in the UK and Ireland, is a strategic agreement between the government, the Commission, and civil society based on a specific human rights commitments and actions. One of the key commitments you can see there, included in the action plan, is to coordinate action across the public, private, and third sector to champion climate justice at home. Now, there are opportunities and challenges emerging from all of these. such as ensuring that climate justice is integrated within the new Global Climate Agreement and the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which will replace the UN MDGs from 2015. And what happens after 2015 will determine the scale, the pace, and equity of any worldwide transition to a low-carbon society. There are also opportunities for us at national or local level to ensure that there is a cross-departmental implementation of climate justice, and in particular that human rights are embedded not only in environmental policy or climate change policy, but also is embedded in education programs, health, etc. Now, the commitments that I mentioned about the National Action Plan should be implemented by 2017. So the National Action Plan was launched last year and runs up to 2017. And we will report annually to the Scottish Parliament on progress, but also to the United Nations, to the Human Rights Council through the UPR, Universal Periodic Review. So since 2009, the Commission has been very active in promoting climate justice, drafting the parliamentary motion, calling for the development of integrated impact assessments, calling for financial support to vulnerable communities, organizing conferences, and leading on the National Action Plan for Human Rights. So that's where we are, and this where we are going as well. And as you can see, human rights has found its way into the policy structures and process and of climate strategy in Scotland. Just to sum up, I argue that climate change can interfere with the effective enjoyment and realization of human rights, and the social dimension has frequently been overlooked. As such, the current approach is incomplete. I suggest that a human rights approach offers legal, moral, and practical benefits to the current climate analysis, and that is crucial to integrate a human rights-based approach in the adaptation strategies to ensure that peoples are protected and their rights are not undermined. And finally, I focused on climate policy in Scotland and argued that Scotland has the capacity to become a model of international best practice for addressing climate change via climate justice. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there any quick questions or comments? We could take one or two. Yeah.
I heard you saying that you wanted to have this embedded in education projects. Have you started doing that, or how do you see that happening?
Well, the action plan is the National Action Plan was developed by the Scottish Society. Actually, what we did was to coordinate the process, and there are three strands in the action plan. One is better culture, the second is better life, and the third is better world. And part of the better culture, there is a program, a specific commitments on improving, not improving education, I shouldn't say improving education, but integrating human rights education into the curriculum in Scotland. And so that's one of the commitments also that the government has done. This commitment that you see here about climate justice is under Better World. So there are three big pillars. So that's how we've seen the embedding in education, human rights, sustainability issues, climate justice issues.
The Scottish Human Rights Commission must be certainly one of the few national human rights institutions working on climate justice.
Yes, we are one of the few working on that very specific issue, but we also share the Commonwealth Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, there is a working group on climate change and human rights. As you know, climate change is a very serious issue for many of the Commonwealth countries, particularly those small island states. So we are working with them on this issue, and we learn a lot from countries like Maldives and Malawi, and we bring that home, but also we develop some theory and thinking at home, and then we take that. We are the commissions all around the world are a bridge between the international standard, the UN, and what is happening at home. So that's one of the key functions that we have in society.
And in terms of, at the moment you're chairing the European network, is climate justice something that is being brought into the discussions at European level through that?
No, it hasn't. Unfortunately, it hasn't. So it's very much about consensus, and we hasn't achieved that consensus. Although there is, as you might know, there is a working group on business and human rights, and many of the aspects of business and human rights relate to climate justice and climate change. So there are some areas that the two overlap, but there is no specific working group on climate change or climate justice.
And does your overseas work link in with, say, overseas development policy of the UK, or do you link into that, or do you work quite separately?
It doesn't link with the UK, and then that's politics, and I'm being recorded here, and the UK government is not very keen on the idea of climate justice, and I shouldn't say that now that I'm recorded. It's the Scottish government who champions and promotes climate justice, and but no, the UK government. Yeah, maybe I should stop there in terms of politics.
DFID has an office in Scotland, doesn't it? Do you rate the UK Department for International Development is in Scotland, but do you relate to them at all? Or?
Very little. No, we work particularly in climate justice exclusively with the Scottish government, and no with the UK government.
So you're voting for independence?
No. We are neutral. We are neutral in the debate. Our work is to promote and protect human rights. We are not pro against independence.
That's interesting. No, it's interesting that it's also part of what's being discussed as a priority for Irish aid and human rights and Irish foreign policy, but there isn't as much concrete action in relation to that.
Yeah. One of the concrete actions that I mentioned is the Climate Justice Fund. So after the Parliament passed the motion, they said, well, this is all nice, probably just pros and politics, but it wasn't actually. So they created a fund for countries that they have a historic connection, in particular with Scotland, but to help vulnerable communities there. So £3 million, and then they renewed those 3 million last year, and they want to make that fund quite sustainable. And of course, £3 million is a drop in the ocean, but Scotland is a small country.
Okay.
But
thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Within that climate justice fund, what kind of projects have been launched or are being implemented?
Yeah,
just to have an idea.
The first £3 million were mostly for water projects.
In which continent? In Africa?
In sub-Saharan Africa, yeah. And then the second batch of the funding has expanded as I said before, was only water project, but it has expanded the remit of the fund and to include more climate justice related issues as women and protection of women in those vulnerable countries. climate related, climate justice related rather than climate change only related.
Is there a list somewhere of the kinds of projects that have been funded?
Yes,
that have
yes.
been
You can find more about that on the Scottish Government website, which is not that I'm promoting because we are independent from the government.
They're not independent.
And from the parliament.
Yeah.
Thank you.